på engelsk, og det kanskje er et par i salen som ikke kan så mye norsk, så tar jeg resten på engelsk. Welcome everyone, and to this talk by the world-famous economic dissident Steve Keen. It's the hosts are Manifest Analyse and Rogato Myanmar, and we're very proud to have him here in Oslo, talking for you and for all of us. This will be done in the following fashion. Steve will do his talk, and afterwards there will be a question and answer section. If you have any questions, you can sign up by waving at Lars, that's him, and then you will come up here and shoot. We'll have 3 questions at a time. Okay. For efficiency. Trond Andres, would you like to have a couple of words before we start?
Yes, Steve and we became friends in 1997 and have cooperated many years since then. He has been to Norway several times in Trondheim, where I live at our university, NTNU. And I'm an engineer and Steve is an economist, and what we agreed upon from the first date we met is that an economy is a dynamic system, and that's not many economists that don't agree with that. Steve will say a lot about it. I'm not saying anything more. Just I have Steve's. You allow me, Steve, to raise my hand and say go a bit slower, because you have a tendency to go too fast. So don't get too excited if I say to Steve a lot slower tempo. So by that I just
okay. Thanks very much for the invitation. And Trun is right, I speak far too quickly. So if you start seeing me talking too quickly, give me the slow down signal, and I'll try to slow down to a reasonable speed. And what I know that the title I've given here is not quite what I've seen advertised, but it's very similar, and that's what we're calling the self-destruction of academic economics. Because even though economics is incredibly dominant, is that close enough, or should I bring the microphone closer? Let's see. Great, thank you. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Even though economics is incredibly dominant politically, in academic circles it's almost destroyed itself. And I want to put a bit of history on that. If I go back to when I was an undergraduate student, do we have any first-year students in the room? Hey, good, okay. Well, when I was in your situation, a long time ago, if you had to do any degree in business, and I don't just mean an economics degree, I mean an accounting degree, or even if marketing was taught at that time as a university subject, 40% of your units at the university I went to, Sydney University, had to be in economics. And I think that was pretty much globally the case. So back then, the way that this is showing how old I am, but back then you had to do 10 full-year units to get a business degree over 3 years. And 4 of those units were economics. 2 in first year and 1 in second and third year. 1 was micro for the entire year. The second year was macro for the entire year. Then international trade theory for the entire year. And 1 of your other subjects in first year had to be mathematics for economists. So 40%. Now, I don't know, are you doing economics? Lucky you. Okay. But now if you look at if you have to do as any degree, in most universities you have to do 1 unit out of 24 semester-long units over 3 years. So it's gone from being 40% to roughly 4% in 40 years, which when you think about it is a pretty successful linear regression, but not what they were trying to achieve, obviously. So if you look over time and see how much of the course was economics, back in 1973, pretty much 40% of what you did had to be economics, and by 2013 it was down to 4%, which is pretty reliable regression, which implies by 2016 there should be no economics in the business degree. And I think that's a bloody good idea. I'll explain why in a moment. Now, maybe I'm to blame, because if you look at my career, I began as an academic in the 80s, but effectively I caused a student revolt, or was part of a student revolt at Sydney University that began in 1973. And in 2013, my then university shut down its economics degree. So maybe it's my fault that it's fallen that much over 40 years. I don't really think so. That was me as a young stirrer. That's now me as a person calling the warning about the crisis, a little caricature of me from the newspaper. But it's more about what economics did to itself. Because if you take a look at economic theory and how it's taught, it's worse than hell. Now I know hell is in Norway. I was there earlier today, took the obligatory photograph of the Hell Hotel. But I'm talking about the real hell. And economics is a very unpopular subject, not just with students suffering through it, except for those few who become true believers and then become rabid neoclassical professors at a later stage. It's also extremely unpopular with other academics in business. And I realised this when I was a student, because I actually used the printing press of the Economic History Department and the Economic Statistics Department and the Accounting Department to produce my anti-economics leaflets, with the full compliance of the staff of those departments. So other academics really can't stand economics. So a lot of reason why people become a marketing professor or a management professor, etc., is because they were driven balmy by economics and told what you're interested in is not serious, go do something else. So they start another department. What actually happens over time is, this is the attitude people have got to it. What's the definition of hell? It's the eternal economics seminar. So that's the vision that a lot of people have of economics, and justifiably so. So what has happened is that at a faculty level, it used to be, as I said, 40% of the subjects had to be economics. Now, there would be a vote coming up about changing the business degree to include, say, one more marketing unit. And the economist would say, no, the students have to have this many units of economics to be able to work successfully in marketing. And the other faculty professors would listen to the economist making that case, nod their heads, smile, and vote them down. And so you'd go from 40% to 36% to 32%, etc., all the way down to the stage where at my original undergraduate university, Sydney University, has evicted the economics departments, plural, both of them, there are two, evicted them both into the arts faculty. So there is no economics department in the economics faculty at Sydney University anymore. Of course, they've renamed it the business faculty. So for 40 years they've been losing this battle in academic circles, but they've been winning the battle in public policy. And if you look at how they've gone, they've become actually more virulently anti-reality, I would say, than they were in Keynes's day. Because if you look at Keynes writing about what he thought about, he called them classical economists, but by classical he meant Marshall and so on. And he didn't see a discontinuity between Ricardo and Marshall, whereas in modern terms we do see a discontinuity. But talking about the neoclassical economists of his day, he wrote this wonderful phrase in a short essay called The General Theory of Employment. If you haven't, has anybody here tried to read The General Theory? Okay, keep your hand up if you succeeded finishing it. A couple, okay. It isn't the world's best written book. Parts are brilliant, other parts are awful. I think I'd recommend reading the papers that Keynes wrote in 1937, which are universally good, short, very powerful, and much clearer about what he was bringing in that was new. So one of them is called The General Theory of Employment, not employment, interest and money, just the general theory of employment. And he says in there, I accuse the classical economic theory of being one of those pretty polite techniques which tries to deal with the present by abstracting from the fact that we know very little about the future. Now, that was a pretty strong criticism of the theory back in those days. And he talked about them being a bit like Euclidean geometers who live in a non-Euclidean world but don't know it, and therefore get angry when parallel lines meet at infinity. Because a non-Euclidean surface is the planet, okay? And a parallel line on the planet meet at the north and south poles. So Euclidean world is one in which parallel lines do intersect. If you have a model that says we live in a flat universe, you're going to have a pretty hard time on a spherical planet. Well, that's, I think, pretty much the dilemma of economic theory. So he said we have to work out a non-Euclidean geometry for economics. That was his vision back then. Now, far from abstracting from the fact that we know very little about the future, to these days they pretend we can predict the future accurately. And they pretend that even after they failed to predict the crisis we're now in. I find a wonderful irony. This is what religious groups do. When they predict that there's going to be a satellite's going to come past and kill the rest of humanity and take their little sect up onto the satellite, and it doesn't happen, they invent a new myth shortly afterwards. Ignore the fact they got the other one wrong. Here, neoclassical economics predicted smooth future and continues to predict a smooth future even when we're in a turbulent present. Bizarre. But what's actually happened? Well, if you look at where what's called rational expectations comes from, it's put across as saying people use all available information, etc., very polite terms. But if you look at where the literature actually began from, this is Lucas writing back in 1972, bringing rational expectations into macroeconomics. And what he does is he says that if you believe that people's expectations adapt, so you learn from experience, if you believe that, then that means that the government, first of all, if their model of the economy is correct, the neoclassical model is correct, which it's not, but it's starting from the assumption that it was correct, and there was a natural rate of unemployment, then if the government could continually accelerate the rate of growth of the money supply, and people adapted to that, you could permanently push the unemployment rate below the natural rate. Now, because he didn't want to reach that conclusion, he said, how do we avoid that conclusion? And he says, if the impossibility of a non-zero value, meaning the gap between actual inflation and expected inflation, cannot be zero, must be zero for the natural rate. Okay, so therefore, expected inflation must be actual inflation. Therefore, your expectations of inflation must be accurate. That's required to get the natural rate hypothesis. He said, how do we get there? We can either lead simply to adding the assumption that the gap is zero as an additional axiom. In other words, let's assume people can predict the future. Then he says, or to assume that expectations are rational in the sense of Muth. That to me is the best transparent statement of what rational expectations is. It's not rational expectations, it's prophetic expectations. It's assuming people can prophesise the future. Then that's used to argue that government policy can't work even for one period. This is Sargent and Wallace writing in 1976 with what they call the policy ineffectiveness proposition. And they say that by virtue of the assumption that expectations are rational, the authority, i.e. the government, cannot exploit the Phillips curve, this trade-off between unemployment and inflation, for even one period. In other words, government policy can never be effective. Now that's how strong these statements were. They put them across as saying it's sensible to say people have a model of the economy in their heads. It's sensible to say they try to forecast forward, etc., etc. But what they mean by rational expectations is meta-rationality, not being sensible about what you know and behaving on that basis, which is standard rational behaviour, but actually understanding the entire economy, the entire complex system, knowing what's going to happen as a result of some change, and therefore adapting your behaviour so that things work out perfectly. That's far more delusional than what Keynes had to deal with. And that's what I've got to fight these days, of people calling themselves rational. Now, the trouble is, for a while after those ideas came out, the economic data appeared to support this idea of that you can make absurd assumptions like that, and they can tell you it's just a simplifying assumption. I've got told that so many times. It's not a simplifying assumption. Like, for example, I could make a simplifying assumption saying that I can jump to the moon. That's not a simplifying assumption, that's a fantasy. Well, that's what they think is a simplifying assumption. But for a while it appeared to work, because if you looked at the economic data, the level of inflation, which was rising, and unemployment, which was rising, started to trend down. And, if you go back to the 1970s, Milton Friedman became dominant in 73 with the explosion in inflation and unemployment at that time. That was when he effectively killed the bastard version of Keynesian economics that Samuelson had promoted, and we moved across to the monetarist ideas of Reagan and Thatcher. And then from that point on, one more big boom in inflation and unemployment, but then the trend was declining unemployment peaks and declining inflation. And by this stage, neoclassical economists were completely in control of treasuries, central banks and universities, and they were congratulating themselves and saying, this is because of our good policy. This is our success as economic managers. And what you got was this rising triumphalism in their public policy, even though they were still losing the battle back at universities. And I was watching them lose this battle and seeing how self-destructive their behaviour was. Why didn't they try to form an allegiance with the accountants or the marketing people? But no, they kept on being purist about the need to learn economics. But in the public policy, this triumphalism turns up. So here's Ben Bernanke saying the low inflation era of the past 2 decades has seen significant improvements in economic growth and a reduction in volatility, which we've called the Great Moderation, and then modestly says, talking a bit more about the details, saying recessions are less frequent and milder, volatility's fallen and as well. He said the sources remain controversial, but he thinks there's evidence for the view that improved control of inflation, by central banks obviously, has contributed in important measure to this welcome change in the economy. Okay? That's how positive and triumphal they were in policy terms. And the same thing was happening in the academy, because even though they were losing the practical battle for how many courses that were taught, they were infiltrating other departments as well. An easy way to get a PhD in management was to steal a 20-year-old idea in economics like game theory and apply it in your management PhD. There was a weird mixture going on there overall. But you had what was called by one prominent economist, this was George Bush's economic advisor. He's actually a very nice bloke, by the way, I might add. I've met Ed Lazer and I like him. I disagree with him fundamentally, but he's a good bloke. That matters to me. He wrote a paper called Economic Imperialism. And in that paper he said economics is not just a social science, it's a genuine science. This is published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, by the way. So it passed referees' beliefs. This is, a shared belief in the profession. He said, like the physical science, it produces refutable implications. Interesting how they react to actual refutation, isn't it? And test them using solid techniques. And there are three factors he focused upon. Rational individuals who maximise, models that adhere strictly to the importance of equilibrium. Okay. And you see that as a hallmark of a science. And finally, focus on efficiency. He said for that reason this is a science, whereas everything else is just a social science, and therefore we can invade the remainder of social science. That was the attitude Lazar had back in 1999. Well, then in the real world, what happens? Well, along comes a refutable event. This is the unemployment data again, but now I'm going to go on a few more years. And here we have this sudden collapse to deflation, and people tend to forget that, but there was a period of falling prices before the enormous government rescue kicked in. And unemployment, which was trending down, as you can see all the way through here, explodes up to the same level as the 1980s. But of course, between 1980 and 2010, there have been so many redefinition of unemployment. We were talking about this today at the Statistical Agency. The ILO definition has changed all the way through. If we use the 1980 definition of unemployment, we would be up here somewhere. Okay. So it's a worse crisis than any crisis in the post-war period. And they had absolutely no idea it was going to happen. Because rather than warning about it, or at least expressing some caution, there was nothing but optimism. And here's some of my favourite statements of the old Dr. Pangloss, if you know that, all's for the best and the best of all possible worlds. This is the OECD Economic Outlook. And in June of 2007, they published this paper saying they expected a smooth rebalancing. With Europe, isn't this good, eh? Europe taking over the baton. I think Europe has flagellated itself with a baton, hasn't taken it over, from driving OECD growth. And he said recent developments have confirmed this prognosis. The current economic situation, June 2007, is in many ways better than what we have experienced in years. This is the OECD advising governments around the world about what they can expect in the very near future. He said, we've stuck to a rebalancing portfolio. Our central forecast remains quite benign. Now imagine you're a politician who really knows nothing other than how to look good in front of a camera. Let's be honest, they're narcissists by nature. Being advised by these guys saying you go and smile about the economic forecasts. 2 months later, the crisis begins. But they thought a soft landing in the States, recovery in Europe, and solid trajectory in Japan and buoyant growth, etc., falling, strong job creation and falling unemployment. That was typical of the forecast being made using the latest models that they call dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. That's what they told the world to expect. Now, let's go a few months forward. By December 2007, the crisis is already 4 months old. People these days tend to date it from the collapse of Lehman Brothers in August 2008. But strictly speaking, the crisis began in August 2007 because that's when the BNP, Banque Nationale de Paris, shut down 3 of its funds that were exposed to the subprime market in America on the basis they simply couldn't put a value on them anymore. These were AAA bonds. My little line these days about things like AAA saying, is it AAA or can I trust it? Back those days, AAA meant absolutely verifiable value. BNP said we simply can't trade these anymore. And that was when you started to see the tightening up of credit. It's August 2007. December 2007, these are the minutes of the Federal Reserve Open Monetary Policy Committee. And here's benign, that word again. This is the chief economist of the Federal Reserve. Despite all the turmoil, they've already seen 4 months of turmoil by this stage, their models are saying the economy would avoid recession and have a modest edging off of inflation. And he then said, so I tried to not take it personally when I received a note that the boards approved more frequent drug testing of certain members of staff, including me. I think the entire profession deserves drug testing. And then he said, we're not going to blame it on mind-altering chemicals. All we had was nothing stronger than late nights of Diet Pepsi and vending machine Twinkies. This is one of the comedians of economics. Okay? But you can find that on the web. That's the Federal Open Monetary Committee transcript from December 11, 2007, 4 months after the crisis has started. So they didn't see the crisis coming, and they had no idea of how big it was going to be, even after it had started. By the time they wrote, later, the NBA would say, the National Bureau of Economic Research would say that's when the recession began, in December 2007. Now, once it really hit, there was nothing but panic, and this is where I met Ed Lazaire at the economics conference in Australia in, I think, 2009, and he honestly said it was just a total sense of panic. They had no idea of what happened, totally caught by surprise, and really thought that if they didn't do something drastic, they would be effectively crucified for causing the collapse of the global economy. That's the state of mind that existed inside the political circles in America at the time. And Paulson, of course, played a major role in the whole thing. He was responsible for the abolition of Glass-Steagall and the whole growth of the derivatives and so on and so forth. But writing in his book On the Brink, he's talking about what he said to the politicians when they were asking what should we do, and he said, we need to buy hundreds of billions of assets. He said, I knew better than to utter the word trillion. That's the scale of injection they thought was necessary. He said, we need an announcement to calm the markets and legislation the week after. He said, when he's asked what would happen if we didn't get it, he said, may God help us all. That's the state of mind they are in. They tend to forget it now, but this is just how seriously stunned they were by the crisis, and how shocked they were by its scale, and terrified by what might take place. Now that's in politics. What's happening in the academy? Well, probably my favourite badly dated paper of all time is by Olivier Blanchard. You know that name at all? Okay, chief economist at the IMF now. He was the founding editor of the American Economic Review Macro, which rejected my paper unrefereed on the financial crisis. He writes the state of macro is good. Facts have a way of forcing out irrelevant theory, and good theory has a way of forcing out bad theory. And they said the new tools created by the Neoclassicals, which are real business cycle models, dominated the technique. The facts emphasised by the new Keynesians, imperfections. A common vision has come out August of 2008. And that wasn't a case of it being published at that stage where you could blame a publication lag inside journals. My paper, which the 95 paper on Minsky, was published in 95, but I wrote the paper in December of 1992. No, he published this as a working paper on an economic working paper archive site on December, I think it was August 8 or August 12, 2008, fully a year after the crisis had already begun. Then it came out a year later in a paper again after that. Now, of course, once that had sunk in, the same person changed his tune somewhat. And he said, what's obvious? Well, the obvious thing is you shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm afraid neoclassical economics has confused the bathwater after the baby's shat in it with the baby. Okay? He said, most of the elements of the pre-crisis consensus remain. And that includes that we must have output and inflation stability, that we can't have a high rate of inflation. The natural rate is true after this gigantic collapse into unemployment. And policymakers should not presume there's some sort of trade-off between the two. Stable inflation is an essential goal, and watch this one. Fiscal sustainability is of the essence, not only for the long term. In other words, he's in favour of austerity. Now, give him credit. After supporting all these policies and then leading to the austerity program that was enforced upon southern Europe. He did admit about a year or two later that all the values he gave for the money multipliers were wrong, and the scale of the downturn was far larger than he expected, and it was all wrong. But in the meantime, how many people suffered? Why do we let a depression force this level of suffering upon the public when they're supposed to be the people who prevent suffering, minimise it, reduce what would happen without their intervention? They've actually made it worse. Now, again, this defensiveness continues. So, talking about the crisis again and saying, should we change? This is Bernanke saying, no, we shouldn't. Shortcomings were, for the most part, less central. That although most economists didn't foresee it, the analysis was still useful and critical in understanding the crisis and designing longer-term solutions to prevent its recurrence. And he said, do these flaws mean we need to change our theory? He said the answer is a qualified no. Now, I love this. Imagine an engineer using this excuse for why a car crashed when it had to go around a corner. He said, well, the car was designed to drive in a straight line. It shouldn't be our fault that it turns over when it has to go around a corner. But that's fundamentally what's being argued here. Economic models were designed for times when there isn't a serious financial crisis. And therefore, because they failed during a financial crisis, it's not their fault. So it's saying economic models are really useful when you don't need them. And when you do need them, if they break down, that's not their problem. What a bullshit argument to justify a bad theory. And he continues to believe that the Great Moderation was an independent event to the Great Recession. And from my point of view, one caused the other. They try to argue that it was just a shock, an unanticipated shock. The only thing which can cause a deviation from equilibrium in these models is what they call unanticipated shocks to technology or tastes, because they have a model of the economy as a profit maximising firm and the model of consumers as a utility maximising agent, making trade-offs between consumption now and consumption in the future. So only shocks to those two parameters can cause a crisis. Now, here is a conventional economist, Ireland, from with the University of Boston, I think, deriding the idea of trying to have a causal explanation that talks about one factor leading to another. And he says attempts to explain movements in one set of endogenous variables, like GDP, by direct appeals to others, like asset market valuations, makes for decent journalism, but rarely for satisfactory insights. Now, that is complete ignorance of the field of dynamic modelling, which applies in the case, for example, of meteorology. We've been making endogenous explanations about the weather all the time and getting them right, because meteorologists accept the instability of the system that they live in. So what he did instead was say, well, the crisis was caused by a shock that was the same size as previous crises, then it got bigger and lasted longer. End of explanation. And on with the theory. So here he says the Great Recession began in late 2007 with a series of adverse preference and technology shocks in roughly the same mix and magnitude of those in previous recessions. But then they continued and got bigger. That is so asinine. That's completely failing to confront the complete absence of an explanation. It's simply saying what comes from outside our model explains everything that went wrong inside the model. That's an abdication of responsibility. But at the end of it, he says the results speak to the continued relevance of the model, not as providing the very last word, but useful insights. How is it a useful insight to say a shock occurred, we didn't expect it to happen, and that's why the crisis is here, and when the shock goes away, end of crisis. Now, it's credible if you have a transient thing. If it's still going on 6 years later, there's something seriously wrong with your model. Now, they talk about change, but the change which is being discussed by people like Paul Krugman, backing away from new Keynesian theory, is to go back to the ISLM model of Hicks. And if anybody who knows what I talk about when I say ISLM? Fair of you, okay. What most of these people don't realise, and I have to actually, I'm being very critical here of neoclassical economists in general. I've got to make a very fast exception. That's for a neoclassical economist in Canada called Nick Rowe, because Nick recently attempted to understand my approach and very accurately conveyed my views in neoclassical terms. So I'm normally knocking them here. And as a part of that, I got Nick to read a paper that he hadn't read, and most neoclassicals haven't read, where Hicks himself disavowed ISLM. You can find this on the web. It's called ISLM an Explanation. And he takes a look at his own model and says the only point in the model that makes any sense, because it's a general equilibrium model, is where the two curves intersect. That's the only point which you can argue actually has any empirical reality, because the rest is hypothetical. If you're off one curve, even if you're on one curve but off the other, you're not in general equilibrium, so the model doesn't describe anything at all, it's only hypothetical. So he said in that situation you must therefore assume that every point in time is an equilibrium point. Now Hicks was writing this particular paper in 78, 79, and we'd had what I see as the beginning of the serious crises of capitalism in 73, 75. So he looked back at that and said, we know that in 1975 the system wasn't in equilibrium. People had plans which failed to carry out as they expected. They had surprises. Now he said to actually stick with the abstraction of using the ISLM model, we have to imagine these things don't matter. He said there's plenty of times where we do that and just assume you can, even though we know it's not equilibrium, let's pretend that it is to do the analysis. He said, but it's dangerous. He said, though there might be periods where you can do that, it's precisely at the turning point where it's hardest to accept it. And he therefore said that the only way ISLM should survive is other than a classroom gadget, okay, is points where equilibrium analysis, even drastically so, is not inappropriate. But he's pretty much saying it's always inappropriate. So they want us to take us back to something that the person who developed has abandoned 30 or 40 years earlier. That's why I don't really believe economics can reform itself. And when it comes to taking on people like myself who are critics, before the crisis occurred, I had this experience with a seminar I gave at NTNU about 10 years ago. If a neoclassical economist came to my seminar, they would normally, and this actually did happen, interrupt, criticise me for not having rational expectations, object to a few other things and walk out. These days they've got to shut up and listen to me, but then they say this stuff behind my back. And Twitter makes it rather more visual. This is a guy called Justin Wolfers, who's a fairly prominent neoclassical, talking about, said, did any of the clowns, okay, who claim to have predicted the crisis actually predict it? What about this case study done by a guy called Noah Smith? Case study. I want to show you how disparaging they are. We had a battle with this guy on Twitter. I have quite a few battles with Noah Smith. He comes out pretty badly in each of them, and he tries to get even afterwards. So he said, how many earlier predictions did Keynes make of imminent global recession that did not materialise? Then he says, according to this website, Keynes was predicting an imminent global recession as early as 1995. But it was 12 or 13 years before it became true. So you can't really take that seriously. Well, according to this website, which website was he talking about? He was talking about the website of the Real World Economics Review, which awarded the Revere Award to me and Nuri Rabini and Dean Baker for picking the crisis. And what did the website actually say? What it actually said was, I concluded my 1995 paper by saying the chaotic dynamics explored in this paper should warn us against accepting a period of relative tranquility as anything other than a lull before the storm. And then it says in December 9, 2005, drawing heavily on his theoretical paper, not empirical, and believing a crisis was coming, that's when I made the warning. So that's the extent to which they'll disparage and not take seriously an alternative way of thinking about the economy. So the real clowns to me are neoclassical economists who don't know their own literature. And this is what I find quite remarkable, because it's fair enough not to read what critics write. For them to read what I write would be a bit like before the ecumenical movement, the Pope reading the Koran. Normally back then you just ignored the other religions. Okay. So this is what's happening now, however. I'm not talking about them ignoring the Koran, I'm talking about them ignoring the Bible. Now this is really weird. Chari, this guy I'm quoting here, Chari, is a very, very prominent neoclassical economist in America, and he was one of 5 people invited to speak to the United States Congress in a hearing they had about economic theory in 2010. And at that hearing, he said that DSGE land, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, is a very big tent. And he said also there's no other way to do economics, no other way to do macroeconomics. He said the useful aphorism is if you have an interesting story to tell, you can tell it in a DSGE model. If you can't, your stereo is incoherent. That's how confident he was this is the only way to do macroeconomics. Now, at the same hearing, Robert Solow was an invited speaker. And Robert Solow, for those who don't know, as well as being a Nobel Prize winner in economics, developed the growth model on which dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models are built. It's called the Solow-Ramsey growth model. So he damn well knew whether you could actually use that model to talk about macroeconomics. And in the same hearing, this is what Solow had to say. He said, when it comes to macroeconomics, a mainstream person like me insists that every proposition must pass the smell test. Does it really make sense? And he says, current models don't pass the smell test. What does he mean? Well, he said they take for granted, these models, take for granted you can model the entire economy as a single consistent person carrying out a rational plan, occasionally disturbed by shocks, but adapting to them in a rational, consistent way. He said that doesn't pass the smell test. And he said the protagonists think it's based on microeconomic behaviour, but he said that's phony. And I'll show you how phony in a moment. And he said the advocates believe what they say, but they've either stopped sniffing or they've got no sense of smell whatsoever. And I completely agree with that. Solow has actually become horrified by what he's actually helped bring about. Now, Solow knew what he was talking about because the stink is caused by what's called the Sonnenschein-Mantel-de-Boer theorem. And this is work done by absolute high priests of neoclassical economics. And what they do effectively, though they don't describe it this way, is they take an economy where all the agents obey what they call the law of demand, where you have individuals have a downward sloping demand curve. If price falls, they buy more units. Okay. It's called the Hicksian compensated demand curve, but that's the basic notion. And having that, they say, well, what if you have a whole lot of people? If they all obey the law of demand, does the market demand curve you derive from these people also obey the law of demand? And the answer is no. Sonnenschein's statement of that was that we prove every polynomial is an excess demand function. Now, if you think about a demand curve, that's a y equals ax minus a minus b times x. Okay, well, that's the slope of the curve. You're setting a negative value on the coefficient. Okay? This is saying a minus b plus c times x squared plus d times x cubed, etc., etc. Any shape at all you can draw that way is a valid demand curve. You find me a textbook that shows you a demand curve like that. So every continuous real valued function is approximately a demand curve. That means you can't do macroeconomics based on micro. You can't scale up from one individual and call it the entire economy. That's part of the conventional literature. Now, one ex-neoclassical economist, Alan Kerman, had a sensible reaction and said, well, what this is telling us, we can't start from the isolated individual. Instead, we may be forced to work at some level of aggregation where people have common behaviours. And what that means is, effectively, social classes. It makes no sense at all to start from the isolated individual and not talk about whether that person is a capitalist or a worker or a banker or a rentier or retired. But it does make some sense to aggregate workers together and capitalists together and bankers together and retirees together, etc., etc., and then talk about aggregate behaviour. And that's what classical economics used to do. We used to work in terms of social classes. So neoclassical economics has proven we should go back to an improved version of classical economics, but that's not, of course, what they've done. Now, normally I would say that this is not read because it doesn't even turn up in the textbooks. But much to my amazement, I found that what was, until recently, the dominant neoclassical textbook for master's and PhD programs actually covers it. It's an 1,000-page book, and I'm sure most examiners completely jump over this issue. But there's no excuse for anybody who owns a copy of that book not to know this theorem, because he then goes through and says, can an arbitrary function be the demand function for an economy? He says, well, it has to be homogeneous at degree 0, satisfy Walras's law, but yes, it's true. Anything goes, it's called. So again, the ignorance that they have is not justified. It isn't that they haven't got it, not reading their Bible, they're not even reading their catechisms, ignoring flaws in their own literature. So what this is teaching is you cannot derive macroeconomics from micro. If you scale it up, it has to be something very different. You can't have the same behaviour at the micro level because of this very flaw. And that's a common thing in most sciences. science has long ago learnt what they called emergent properties, where what happens at an aggregate level cannot be explained by what's happening at the level of the isolated constituents of that aggregate. And there's a beautiful paper, again you can find this on the web, by a genuine Nobel laureate. This is physics, where they actually do award a Nobel Prize, Philip Anderson. And he wrote this beautiful paper called More is Different. And in that paper back in the 60s, that the behaviour of large and complex aggregates of elementary particles cannot be understood in terms of simply extrapolating the properties of a few of those particles, which is precisely what economists try to do with micro to macro. He said instead, at every new level of complexity, entirely new properties appear, and understanding those requires just as much fundamental research as working at the lower level. That's a common understanding in physics. And he said even if we can rank the sciences and say that the elementary entities of science X, like biology for example, obey the laws of science Y, which might be molecular biology or chemistry. He said, but that doesn't mean that biology is simply applied chemistry. If it did, a typical biology assignment would be, please take these chemicals and create life. Okay. You'd be regarded as a lunatic if you thought that was possible in biology, but you're not regarded as a scientist in economics unless you believe precisely the same thing. Take this micro theory and derive macro. So new laws, new concepts, new generalizations are required at all levels. And as you said, psychology is not applied biology, nor is biology applied chemistry, and equally, macroeconomics is not applied micro. But that's what they've reduced it to with this fixation on micro foundations. And what they also do, Anderson describes well before they started doing it, by the way, this is a 1972 paper, is constructionism. This is the belief that you must construct a higher level like macro from a lower level like micro. And he said the main fallacy is that even if reductionism works, that doesn't imply constructionism as an intellectual technique, because the ability to reduce everything to simple fundamental laws doesn't mean you can derive the universe in reverse from those fundamental laws. He said, in fact, the more this is a guy who's got a PhD in quantum mechanics and gets a Nobel Prize for quantum mechanics. What he said, the more I know about the fundamental laws of physics, the less relevance they appear to have to the real problems of the rest of science, let alone society. So this is the wisdom we need in economics, but it's not getting through. Now Solo, as I said, actually criticises it, and give you an idea of the flavour of this. This is a paper which you can find on the web by Solo. It was a tribute to Joe Stiglitz, and given in a building in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology on the 15th floor. The room was 15 floors up. He titled the paper Dumb and Dumber in Macroeconomics. You know the movie? Okay, this is economics as Jim Carrey. He said the preferred model has a single consumer optimizing over infinite time with perfect foresight in an environment which realises those more or less flawlessly for perfectly competitive forward-looking markets and perfectly flexible prices and wages. Then says, how could anyone expect a sensible short to medium term macro to come out of this setup? This is the smell test thing. And then he said, what about this fixation on equilibrium as well? Now he's responsible for causing some of that, but he's saying he's quite willing to say he's willing to assume equilibrium in the long run, but you certainly can't assume it in the short term. So he said this choice between equilibrium and disequilibrium may be false. I think that's quite a wise statement. He says, if I drop a ripe watermelon from the 15th floor floor, I suppose I could describe the whole process from TO to the mess on the sidewalk as some sort of dynamic equilibrium. He said, that might not be the most fruitful, way to describe the falling watermelon phenomenon. In other words, we have to do dynamics. That's what I've been arguing with the help of Trond trying to push through. But despite all that, the neoclassical ship just continues sailing right on past the whole thing until the crisis hit in 2007. And they ignore alternative explanations of reality. So Ben Bernanke is regarded as an expert on the Great Depression. He is not an expert on the Great Depression. He is an expert on explanations of the Great Depression that are consistent with neoclassical theory. Now, the only explanation that's consistent is it can't possibly be the economy's fault, so it has to be somebody else's. So we can blame the Federal Reserve. I think it's justice that he ended up being Federal Reserve Chairman when the second crisis struck. But here he's saying let's ignore Fisher because debt deflation is just a redistribution from one bunch of agents to another. And then after the crisis, see, if you look back at the Great Depression, Fisher was the leading neoclassical economist, and he truly underwent a cathartic revelation as to the nature of economics and rejected equilibrium. So he genuinely progressed and changed his mind dramatically. But this time round, they're still hanging on to these pre-crisis beliefs that you can ignore the monetary system. And here he's saying, this is Krugman now, even after the crisis, saying we can ignore banks' debt and money because lending from one person to another is just a swap of one person's asset for another person's liability. The level of debt doesn't matter. Well, if that's the case, my analysis says that there's some sort of relationship between change in debt and level of economic activity. Now that correlation there is minus 0.77 over 40 years. It looks like a Rorschach plot to some extent. Can you ignore that? That's an empirical datum. And I cannot get them to take a look at that data and say, well, explain this. This is a relationship between acceleration of mortgage debt and change in house prices. That's again supposed to be close to zero so far as they're concerned. Again, over 60 years there, a correlation of 0.74. This is stuff which are empirical contradictions of their beliefs. Now, if this happened in any genuine science, it'd be good night Josephine, ultimately, to that theory. Max Planck made the case many, many decades ago that this actually happens because young people come along who can accept the new ideas and the old ones eventually retire or die. That doesn't seem to happen in economics. Instead, the zombie ideas continue living on because we don't have this definitive experience that they have to acknowledge was different to what they thought would happen. For physics, the classic story was the black body radiation theory, which could not be explained by Maxwellian theories of radiation. It took Planck and quantum mechanics to explain that, and ultimately that's what gave us 20th century physics. That doesn't seem to happen to economics. So I don't think they're going to reform themselves. That comes back to my starting point. We can't rely upon economics to reform itself in this situation. Something else has to come along. Now, there are some rays of hope, even though at the moment I think they're falling back into the same ways of behaving. Central banks and treasuries and statistical departments as well, I can say, having been to the one in Norway today, give us some chance for alternative views where, because they're required to come up with workable predictions for politicians, there's more pressure on them to get something resembling reality rather than the fantasies that get taught at university. And anthropologists and lawyers are getting involved. This is a great book by a guy called Felix Martin about money. I recommend reading. You've also got David Graeber's equally excellent book, Debt the First 5,000 Years. So fortunately, economics is suffering imperialistic attacks of its own and it deserves them. And the social media also gives us a capacity to fight. This is a good friend of mine, Dirk Bessemer, based in the Netherlands, who has done some beautiful work on modelling the role of change of debt and driving the economic performance. So I'll save this to my presenters here, and if you click on that you can watch the YouTube video. I think it might be okay. And the media itself has gone from being a cheer squad for this stuff to a critic. So Anatol Koleski, who was a strong supporter of neoclassical economics, is now a member of the Institute for New Economic Thinking and arguing for the need for change. And that institute is an important element of change as well. People like John Harvey, who's a fellow post-Keynesian economist, has got a column in Forbes. So the media is no longer the running dog of neoclassical economics. So there's some possibilities there. And comedians are getting in on the act as well. This just happened to me recently. I've always been a great fan of the Monty Python crew. So it's a dream for me one day when I got asked to come and do an interview with Terry Jones. If you remember, he's not the Messiah, he's just a naughty boy. So there's going to be a documentary hopefully coming out in the next month or two done by Terry Jones about economics. Okay, with all the satire of Monty Python. So hopefully we can laugh the bastards out of the academy. And computer software is helping as well. Technology that didn't exist back in the Great Depression is now commonplace. So if you want to do a multi-agent model of the economy and have those interactions at the agent level, you can use programs like NetLogo to build agents, models of interacting non-homogeneous agents and see what happens. That's a model of a predator-prey system there done in NetLogo. And I've now contributed a software package which was funded by the Institute for New Economic Thinking and also by a Kickstarter campaign called Minsky, It's an open source program. You can download it from SourceForge. Just search for Minsky and Keen and you'll find it certainly on the web. And that lets you simulate the monetary system and the economy as a dynamic process. So we do have some hope there. And there's also a dark cloud that gives some hope, because we face potentially decades more of deleveraging. This is the level of private debt in America, the red line, from 1840 to today. The best way I could reconstruct the data. So the crisis we had involved a level of debt that was far greater than they had back at the time of the Great Depression, even with the deflation that drove that debt ratio up back then. We're now starting to see a turnaround here because the private sector has been encouraged back into taking on debt once more by all the rescues of the financial system. But we're starting from a debt level which is unprecedented. So the headroom for this to continue, I think, is quite restricted. What's more likely to happen is there'll be a bit of a revival, then the private sector will start deleveraging again, fall back into a crisis. Government stimulus again, rescue the financial sector again, same old thing, rinse and repeat. Now the Japanese have done that for 25 years, but the Japanese have got three advantages over the West in doing it, or four actually. One is they were doing it when the rest of the world was running a Ponzi scheme. So they could sell Japanese goods to Ponzi shoppers in America and Europe. They're socially cohesive as a group. They have nothing like the social conflict that applies in Europe and America. They're running a trade surplus all the way through, and they have their own currency. Now, there are plenty of countries where none of those factors apply in the rest of the world. So I don't believe we could survive 20 years of what the Japanese have been through. So we have to get rid of neoclassical economics. Not going to reform it itself. And I've got a suggestion, coming back to my starting point. Why not finish the job of getting rid of it? Why not shut economics down completely? But that's where we're going to seem to be heading. That's where they've managed to get by their absolutely stupid tactics in the academy about what's taught in business degrees. Why not get rid of it? The only thing which actually is preserving that one unit that's still taught in most universities around the world is that a unit in economics is compulsory for accountants. So why don't we get the accountants to develop their own alternative, which is monetary, which you could do with my Minsky software and integrate how accountants think about the economy with double entry bookkeeping with how I model money in that program and include it with dynamics as well. If that was done, so there was no need for a compulsory course in business at all in economics, then the cash cow that keeps these neoclassical departments open would be shut off. And then you might have anthropology and history and engineers developing economics courses because they wouldn't face any rivals from the economics department, which would be a rump. And we might finally get something decent out of economics. So I'm actually in favour of finishing the job and going to zero. And that might finally get us away and get a revolution in economics. Thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna kick off with some questions from the crowd. I'm gonna have to ask you to introduce yourselves, name and what you study or where you work, if you please. I'm gonna start off since I'm here. I have 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah.
First one I asked you down in SSB.
Yeah.
About economical experts seeing or like in the media seeing that we have increasing lending from banks and seeing that as a good sign, and like yes, the economy is back on track again. The second colleague of yours, which I think you know, Norbert Hering, the German economist. I wrote an article about from him. He said that he had gone through 102 or something like that papers from the European Central Bank on the crisis, and not one of them mentioned debt. What does that say about their understanding of this crisis, which I think is generally known as a debt crisis? Third, do you see any differences between the academics and the more the bankers in how they assess these problems.
Well, on the first one, this is showing you the level of private debt in America in the last 20 years, and you can see that the fall in the debt ratio, including also an absolute fall in debt, and now it's just starting to rise once more, which means there's some debt finance spending turning up in the economy once more, and therefore that's giving you, pardon me, that's better? That's giving you a boost to growth. So there is that positive sign at that level, but it's a positive sign overlaid on that level of debt. Now, you simply can't have continually rising debt past that pattern for much longer. So you might get a period of rising debt, but plenty of ventures are going to be failing. There'll be plenty of unsuccessful projects taken on, particularly when a lot of this is finance market speculative debt, not real investment at all. So you'll start seeing another fall back down into a crisis once more. Maybe not as deep as the one we went through first time round, because at least they're prepared for some sort of downturn, but a continual return to crisis all the way through. And that's why I expect to see stagnation. So it's not a good thing. What we should actually be doing is working out how to bring this debt down unilaterally, down to about here. If we can reduce that debt level by government action, and I'm talking about reducing private debt here, a debt jubilee, and some a modern one to take account of the mess that the financial sector's made of our monetary system and debt levels, then we'd have a booming economy again, potentially, because the debt burden would be minor and the economy could grow strongly as it did back in the 50s and 60s. So that's what we've got to do. Instead, we're trying to get it to go back up in this direction again, so it's not good. In terms of whether the bankers are behaving differently to the economists, yes, there is some difference now. At least the crisis has driven a wedge between the academic economists and the so-called professional ones. The professional ones used to kowtow to the academics because normally you got a job as a professional economist if you didn't finish your PhD. Okay? Or you didn't do well enough to get yourself a job in an academic, if you didn't get the papers written out of your PhD to get an academic position. There was a certain obsequiousness. Not anymore. Okay? Now a lot of the professional economists, the business ones, are annoyed at the academic economists and see them as being slightly unreal. And that comes back to the central banks. I find central banks, which used to be much more conservative, and treasuries, much more conservative, there's now some pressure on them to get some level of realism. So that's improved. The second question I've managed to jump over, what was it again?
It was about the ECB.
The ECB, yeah, Norweg's research. Yeah, it just shows that they will not consider change in debt as a potential source of a crisis, because as far as they're concerned, the level of debt has no macroeconomic impact. This is what's called the loanable funds model. And that model is effectively if I borrow money from you and then I repay it, my spending power drops but yours rises. So one cancels the other out and you can ignore it. That's the picture they have. But if you pay money back to a bank, if you have a debt to a bank, which means you've got money in your bank account, and you then pay some of that back to the bank, you reduce the amount of money in the economy. It isn't the case the bank can spend what you've paid back. Okay? So the balancing act that they pull there to say they therefore ignore the level of debt is institutionally wrong. It would only work in a world in which there were no banks and where lending was simply from individual to individual. So that's an enormous level of ignorance, and it's one reason I've written the Minsky software, to be able to contrast that sort of stuff. If you look for a presentation I've given on YouTube where I compare loanable funds to endogenous money, I show how to simulate the difference between the two using a Minsky software. So do take a look at that. That'll answer that question very thoroughly.
Any questions from the audience? Come on.
Thank you. My name is Ebba, and I work for Manifest, and I'm a former student of economics in Oslo. And I was wondering, have you looked at the situation? How much have you looked at the situation in Norway? You have a very high debt. Especially when you look at household debt, the debt is very high compared to household income.
Yep.
And when people talk, and some economics have said that's okay because our Norwegians, the value of our houses is so big.
Gee, I'd never heard that argument before. How remarkably original that is. Normally, actually, Norway is a pretty original place. One of my favourite places to visit because I do think you are an innovative society, but that's the standard old bullshit. Fortunately, just recently, the Bank of International Settlements has published 2 data series that make it possible to dive into that argument in some detail. And the Bank of International Settlements was the only formal institution to warn of the crisis before it happened. And the reason was that their research director is a guy called Bill White, Canadian guy, who was a fan of Minsky. And my jaw would just hit the floor when I'd read BIS documents, expecting to laugh at them like I did at the OECD and IMF, and instead think I could have written this. Now, Bill infused the BIS with an awareness of the role of private debt and so on, and what the BIS has done just recently is publish 2 data sets based on that understanding. One is of the level of private debt over time across as many countries as they could get data for from their member banks, and the other is house prices. So looking at Norway, which I can now finally do, you have a private debt problem. The black line is Norwegian total private debt, the dotted line is American. So you're carrying a bigger debt burden than America. Okay, and it's mainly in the business sector debt where they happen, and did a very, very big spike, as you can see, from 2008 to 2010, and then a decline again. But what's actually attenuated it for you is your strong oil revenues, and you have a strong industrial manufacturing society as well. So when I actually take a look at the relationship between change in debt and economic activity, it's much more extreme in America than it is here, even though you're carrying a higher level of debt. So this is looking at the relationship between acceleration of debt and change in unemployment. And my argument here, which is quite heretical, I explained it in this presentation I gave to Statistics Norway today that I'll be putting up on my YouTube channel tonight or tomorrow, and that is that I redefine effective demand to be income plus change in debt. I get accused of making double counting errors there. I know I'm not. I've still got to explain the mathematics to even people on my own side of economics, but the demand in a credit-driven economy is the sum of income plus change in debt, whereas expenditure is on goods and services, but also assets. So you get a relationship between change in debt and the level of economic activity, and between acceleration of debt and change in asset prices. And this is now showing that relationship between acceleration in debt and change in economic activity for America. And you can see over the last 25 years how strong the correlation is, how deep the downturn was. With decelerating debt, you had plunging employment. And there's the correlation minus 0.88. Again, a pretty strong correlation between the second differential, like the rate of change of debt, correlated to the rate of change of unemployment over 25 years. That again is a statistical, empirical datum that must be investigated, but they continue ignoring. So that's America. What about Norway? Your figure's minus 0.43, a lot lower. Still a causal link, but nowhere near as strong. So it's implying your economy in that sense has got more resilience based on its GDP than it has dependence upon debt. So that's the positive side. What about housing? Do you have a housing bubble? This is again that same data series. And yes, Dorothy, you have a housing bubble. House prices here have tripled in real terms since 1993. So in 20 years, your house prices have become 3 times as expensive in real terms. But what's driving it? There could be rising prosperity in Norway causing rising prices here, potentially, because you import a lot of what you eat, etc., etc. But when I take a look at that acceleration relationship between accelerating debt and change in asset prices, everybody agrees now America is in a bubble. Well, here's America's data. This is the relationship of accelerating mortgage debt, which is the red line, and change in house prices over the last 40 years. And you can see the correlation is 0.7. Again, a pretty strong correlation. Now, what's the data for Norway? If it was the case that your bubble was actually based on your house prices were based on real factors, I'd get a lower correlation, like I showed you for unemployment. Here's the Norwegian situation. Higher correlation. So I think empirically you have a debt bubble driving house prices. You have got a house bubble. Notice also the data that I got from the BIS, the house price data stopped in 2012, but the debt data continued on to 2013. So my expectation was you'd be having falling house prices in Norway right now because your acceleration of debt, household debt, is negative. And apparently that's been confirmed to me. That's what's actually happening right now. So you've got a bubble, you've got to get out of it, and if you tame it before it causes too much damage.
Any more questions? Ja, kom hit. Den är inte så lång med ledningen.
Okay, my name is Vetle Oppheim, not to be confused with Robert Oppenheimer. I'm a economics master student here at the University of Oslo.
Yeah.
And I would like to thank you for coming here, Steve, because I'm a big fan of your work, and I really enjoyed listening to you here. My first question is, do you have any policy proposals in terms of reducing the levels of private debt?
Yeah.
And secondly, if such a policy was implemented, are there any, how would you deal with the fallout in the financial sector afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, my basic policy there is what I call a modern debt jubilee. And this is to reinstitute the knowledge that you find in ancient societies that the debt level cannot be allowed to get out of control. And the work that's been done here by people like Michael Hudson and David Graeber in popularising that work, and Felix Martin as well, Cornelia Wunsch, who've actually read the cuneiform tablets from the Mesopotamian society. You find back in those societies they had an understanding that debt rises exponentially, but productivity of the land rises in like an S-shaped curve. And when translating those cuneiforms, they basically were showing like a graph of exponentially rising debt and then cut it back to zero again. And then the system restarts every 50 years. So they realised the need to abolish private debt. The reason was, when it first happened with the Assyrian Empire, was that the Assyrian army was a volunteer army. But most people were peasants. And if you borrowed money from a moneylender to buy the seed for next year's output and then the seed didn't sprout, you became a debt slave. And the more debt slaves, the less there were military for the Assyrian army. So the Assyrian army faced defeat. So the solution initially was to behead the moneylender. Then they tried a slightly less drastic solution of abolishing the debt every 49 years, which became the Jubilee. Now we try to pretend that we're much smarter and more sophisticated than that, but take a look, if I can actually find the correct chart here, that level of debt. There's something systemic about rising private debt in our society as well, and we can see the damage it's doing. So we have to reduce that debt as well. Now maybe we should behead a few people in JP Morgan. I'm sure it'd be an entertaining spectacle. But what we should instead do is use the capacity of the government sector to create money to cancel that private debt. And we could do it in such a way that government's money creation capacity through the central bank was transferred to individuals on condition that if you had debt, you had to pay the debt down. No choice. Okay? If you have debt, you've got to reduce it. If you don't have any debt, you get a cash injection. Now, that would compensate people who see themselves as savers for what they've bought in terms of bonds and assets of banks that they thought were high quality. They'd lose because those bonds would be cancelled by the whole process, but they'd gain with the cash injection. So the idea is to tranquilise or to minimise the damage within the non-bank public, but to reduce the level of bank debt and to reduce the wealth and power of banks. Now you could do that on a small scale. You could sample. You could try like a 2 or 4% of GDP type injection. Actually, as I said, I think we need to reduce the debt levels from here, where they're roughly 160% of GDP, down to about 60%. That's 100% of GDP. That's a huge amount of money to inject and to cancel private money in the process. But you could do it with 5% and see what happened. You wouldn't have to do it on a grand scale. At the same time, you wouldn't want another housing bubble to start. So you have to also change the rules that control banking. And again, the belief that banks should be deregulated is a neoclassical belief. Completely shown to be wrong by the financial crisis. We need to control banks because banks fundamentally profit by creating debt. So they're always going to want to create more debt than we need. Looking at the age of people in this room, most of you, if you're at school, did you ever have a bank come out and give you pretend credit cards? Okay. When I was at school, here we go, showing my age again, they came out with a saving tin. Okay, put your coins away. They've gone from put your coins away to take on debt. So they're always going to turn into debt merchants. And we have to realise that the desirable level of debt for the banking sector is as much as they can pump out. The desirable level of debt for society is enough to enable entrepreneurs to innovate and consumers to buy what they can't buy with cash. For consumption reasons, not for speculation. So we need to control lending for property, and we need to limit the extent to which banks will cause asset bubbles. And that involves regulations that, in my case, I would actually have what I call the PIL, the property income limited leverage, to limit banks to lending no more than some multiple of the income of the asset being purchased. So rather than basing it on the income of buyers, base it on the income of the property. And if a property earns, say, 50,000 euros rent per annum, the maximum a bank could lend to anybody would be $500,000. And therefore, if two people are fighting over it, the person who saves more money, the saving tin approach, is the one who wins. So to get out of this positive feedback between asset prices and debt levels. So changes like that have been necessary. Somebody said earlier, if this policy work, won't we forget them? And the answer is yes, we probably will. But at least we've got to give a try to change and reform the elements of capitalism's instabilities that are worth getting rid of. And clearly taming the financial sector is one of the most important.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Stiglitz, and I just finished a master's in economic development.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is, like, the way I see your argument, you're saying that part of the blame is on regulators that allow sort of capital to flow into new bubbles, when old bubbles could be burst. And my question is, what role does inequality play in this? And does the huge amount of accumulation by the super rich that have a propensity to save rather than spend, could that be part of the explanation?
Yeah, I mean, there's no such thing. One of the lovely T-shirts or slogans you may have seen from the days of the Soviet Union was to say that capitalism is the exploitation of man by his fellow man, whereas socialism is the other way around. So all societies are unequal. All societies are going to have power distributions. What's gone wrong with capitalism is that in recent terms is that an enormous part of that wealth has come out of rising speculation, asset price manipulation, and the finance sector. So if you look at what's called the Kuznets curve for income distribution, that normally shows a rising level of inequality as an economy develops, and then a falling level of inequality once it gets past a certain stage. And Jamie Galbraith, who's the world's leader on inequality research, says that that's now turned up again, and for countries like America, there's now rising inequality with rising wealth. That's one factor. That rising inequality, which is a destructive inequality, has come out of rising debt. When I do my models of Minsky, which I haven't shown you here tonight, but my mathematical models of financial instability, there's a direct causal link between the level of debt and the fall in workers' share of income. So to me, the fundamental class struggle in capitalism is not between workers and industrial capitalists, which is the old Marxist way of looking at it. It's between workers and financial capital. Because even in my very simple model, where it's the firms that borrow the money, it ends up being the workers who pay for it with lower wage share. And it's a direct causal link. So inequality largely means workers and unemployed getting less money compared to the wealthy capitalists and financiers and bankers. And to me, there's a direct relationship between the two. The social group that pays for rising debt levels, fundamentally, is the working class, even if it's the capitalists who are borrowing the money. So there's a very direct link between inequality and the situation.
Any more? None? That's good.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Oskil. I'm doing a PhD at the University of Oslo in economics, and I got so confused by this whole business faculty story because
Which one?
This business faculty story.
Yeah.
The University of Oslo doesn't have a business faculty, so
What does it have? What does it call it?
it's the Faculty of Social Sciences. But
Oh, okay.
It doesn't matter, but
Yeah.
just not sure if that story really fits everywhere.
Okay,
But,
okay.
just to clear up the confusion. My real question was, you keep using the term economics as a whole in general, but most of your examples here are from macroeconomics.
Yeah.
Could you say to which extent you think your criticism also is relevant for the rest of the field, and perhaps give some examples of... I'm not sure what your opinion is on that. But it's,
But microeconomics?
yeah, this criticism, is it also, does it also have a distinction against the rest of the field, or is it only related to your views on.
I think I've got a potential buy for debunking economics here.
Exactly.
When I first wrote the micro, it was basically a fundamental critique of microeconomics. But everything that neoclassical economists believe is proven in neoclassical micro is wrong. So it's micro is actually the source of this, because, and I speak as somebody who believed this stuff when I did my economics at high school, and then I got to first year university, and you have a vision of a perfect world, because in a fundamental way the neoclassical vision of the world is one without power. It's fundamentally a vision of a perfectly well-functioning anarchist society. Anarchy meaning no power. Okay? And that's a very seductive vision. We all like that feeling. I think it probably goes back to our days when we used to live in Cro-Magnon societies about the size of this room. You know, where you knew everybody and there was no overall power structure, etc., etc. That's very appealing to us. And I think it's a large part of the appeal of this discipline. It argues we can organise an entire global economy that way and have no power, no exploitation. It's a truly beautiful vision. It's absolutely wrong, but it's truly beautiful at the same time. So I think that's what seduces people into it. And when you look at the detail, what's required to make that vision work, things like perfect competition are necessary. Now, what I did in the first edition of Debunking Economics, I realised that the theory of profit maximising behaviour had a contradiction. And I then worked the mathematics into the second edition to work out what the contradiction was. And I explained that in verbal terms in the second edition of Debunking Economics. So profit maximising behaviour, as they define it, is not profit maximising behaviour. Equating marginal cost and marginal revenue does not maximise profits, provably so. And I cover that in the book. The theory of consumer behaviour. People cannot be utility maximising individuals. There's a wonderful experiment done by a very, very careful German researcher called Sippel, where he did an experiment where I think he was actually trying to prove the theory of consumer behaviour, known as the theory of revealed preference. Have you heard of that term at all? Okay. He did it with 12 people initially, and of the 12, 11 violated the principles of revealed preference. So he did it with, I think, 33. To me, what happened was he had a small tutorial group. He thought he'd test it out, show them how the theory actually worked, and you can derive your preferences from your choices, and it failed. So he tried a larger group, and in that larger group, I think it was 30, 19 or 21 out of the 30 also violated the rules. Now what he was doing is a very simple experiment. He gave people 8 different sorts of commodities they could choose to buy with money that was created in the experiment, and gave them 10 samples of different price levels that they could pay for these commodities. And then at the end of the experiment, they got to actually consume one of them. It was things like watching a video clip, soft drink, chips, reading a magazine, that sort of thing. And they actually did it after the experiment. And he said he went through, they were very much trying to maximise, they were trying to get the best they could out of what they were being offered, but their behaviour violated revealed preference completely. He didn't actually try to understand the reason why, but it's actually quite simple to think about, because even if you had, say, like, I'm going to use 10 commodities to make the idea easier, and let's say you had 10 different magnitudes you could look at. So you could have 100 grams of chocolate or 200 up to a kilo, and you could watch 10 minutes up to 100 minutes of a movie and so on. How many combinations are you looking at there? You're looking at 1,000 million. Is it 1,000 million or 10,000 million? 10 to the 10, Tron. 10 to the 6 is a million. So we're talking about 1 billion different combinations. That means if you wanted to put together all the combinations, these just 10 commodities these students are supposed to be deciding what to buy, you could fill 1 billion shopping trolleys. And you're now saying, student, pick the one out of that 1 billion that maximises your utility consistently. It simply overwhelms the capacity for storage of information, let alone decision making. So it's not a model of how people behave. And what is rational behaviour is actually walking into a supermarket where there may be 5,000 products and delineating it into different groups so you can walk out of there in less than an hour. That's rational behaviour. It's reducing your number of choices, not because you're using the optimum, but reducing the choices to make it manageable. So a whole range of ideas they have about behaviour are simply armchair nonsense that we should throw out and build a scientific foundation for micro as well as macro.
Any more questions? None. Okay. Before we call it a day, I would just like to inform that Manifesto Lisa has got some reports on the crisis lying there. You might take a look at if you want to, and I think they have some more stuff talking about literature. This is a great little book of a guy, a great Norwegian artist, CNN calls Eddie Munch. We call him
wasn't
Edvard
good,
Munch.
yeah. The Scream, Krakatoa. I know
That's
it
it,
well.
that's
Yeah,
it.
thank you. Thank you.
And by the way, Debunking Economics is a very good book. I can warmly recommend it to all of you. Yeah, and that's about it. Big hand for Steve Keen.
Thank you.